Hello. Maybe just time. Yeah. Hello. Yeah, my talk is going to be about StarTLS. This is some research I've been doing with some people from the Fachhochschule Münster, together with Damian Podobniak, Fabian Ising, and Sebastian Schinzel. Yeah, just to give them proper credit. So we looked at StarTLS, and there are a few more people coming in. Maybe we'll... Yeah. We looked at StarTLS and we figured out that this is not a very well-researched topic, that there are a number of issues that apparently nobody has looked at before. So in general, if you establish a TLS connections, which is, as I guess you all know, is kind of the common way to have encrypted and authenticated network connections on the internet these days, there's usually two different ways to do this. One is which we call implicit TLS, which is where you just have a separate port for the TLS version of a protocol, and then you just start directly with an encrypted TLS connection. So you start with a handshake, and then you have an encrypted connection. And then there's this other way, which is called StarTLS, where you have a protocol that is plain text, and then you have some mechanism where you can kind of upgrade this plain text protocol into an encrypted and authenticated protocol. And in the web, we only use this normal implicit TLS mode where we have HTTPS, which is on a separate port, which is port 443. So in the web, this StarTLS thing it doesn't exist. And the most common protocol where this is used is all the things that have to do with email. Although there are a few other things where it's used, but email is kind of the most relevant. And the research we've been doing, we have mostly focused on the connection between a client and a server. I will later discuss a bit server to server, but it's kind of a different thing where different considerations come into play. So what we're focusing on is we have a client software, something like Outlook or Thunderbird, so an email client, and that is connecting to a server. Email, basically there are three protocols that are involved with email connections. That's SMTP, POP3, and Imap. And all three of them support this StarTLS. There's a bit of a complication that SMTP is kind of used for two different things. One is, which is sometimes also called submission, where you're, as a client, send your email through your mail server, and the same protocol is used for server-to-server communication. But as I said, server-to-server is not the focus of this research. And also for the client-to-server part, all three of these protocols support implicit TLS, so they all have a dedicated TLS port. So we kind of can choose whether we use implicit TLS or StarTLS. And if we can choose, then there's the obvious question, which one is better? Which one should we use? So how does the StarTLS thing work? These protocols, they are... all three of them are kind of line-based text mode protocols. So we have a client that sends commands to the server and then gets a reply. It's a bit like a command line, and it's also kind of built in a way that you can manually speak this protocol. So maybe some of you have done that you can also use a telnet command to send an email or something like that. And here's an example with an SMTP connection. So the first thing that happens is that the server sends a message that contains this code 220. That's just part of the specification, and then its host name. And then the client answers with this elo command. So there's kind of an older version where it's hello. And then in the more modern version of SMTP, it's elo with its own host name, or which also can be a bogus host name. And then the server answers with a line of what the server supports, basically a list of features. And what you can see here, that in this list of features, there's this StarTLS, which means, okay, the server just told us it supports this StarTLS command. And then the client can send this STARTTLS command, then it gets back again a message that kind of confirms that the server received that message. And then there's a handshake happening. So after that, the connection is encrypted. And then we basically start over again because the first of all, the list of features from the server can change. And second of all, we cannot really trust any data that we got before the TLS handshake because that was plain text that can be manipulated by an attacker. And then we can log in and send an email. Yeah. But the relevant part is basically, it's the very simple idea. We have one command that initiates the TLS connection, and then we do a handshake. So there's first something obvious, and that is that if we use the STARTTLS in an opportunistic way, then this is not secure against a network attacker. So this was sometimes done in the past where there were clients that implemented STARTTLS, but in a way where they said, if the server supports STARTTLS, then I will do STARTTLS, and if the server doesn't support it, we will do a plaintext connection, which is sometimes called Opportunistic Tls. And it is obvious that this does not provide any protection against an active attacker, because the attacker can, for example, just strip out this STARTTLS capability from the server answer, and then the client thinks the server doesn't support it. So, but this is not very common in modern mail clients. So most modern mail clients, if you configure them to use STARTTLS, they will enforce it. So they will use STARTTLS, and if it's not supported, they will just not connect, which is the reasonable thing to do. So attacking this has also sometimes been called STARTTLS stripping, but that is kind of not the focus of our research, because we consider that as an obvious thing. Like if you have optional encryption that can be downgraded by an attacker, that is not secure. But it turns out this is not the only security problem that you have with STARTTLS. So if you think about what STARTTLS is, then it's kind of something like a state transition, where you have a protocol that can have two different states. It can be in a non-encrypted state and in an encrypted state. And we have this transition where we move from the plaintext state to the encrypted state. And this raises a number of questions which don't have very satisfying answers. So first of all, you can ask, okay, these email protocols, they have a number of features. Which of them are allowed before we do this TLS transition? So which features can I use in the plaintext version of the protocol? Then also, how should I treat the data that I got before the TLS handshake? What should I do with it? Should I trust it in any way? And also, can there be situations where an implementation gets confused which data was part of the plaintext part or which was part of the encrypted part? So one example of these issues is Imap has a feature that's Imap Alerts, which the protocol says they can be sent at any time. So we can send them before the TLS transition happened. And what does this mean? An alert, it's basically the server sends a message to the client, and then the client application shows this to the user. So, and what this means is if we use STARTTLS, then as an attacker, we can insert such an alert, and then a message will be shown to the user that looks like it comes from the mail server, even though it's from the attacker. So here's a screenshot of such a message in Outlook, where, yeah, the attacker has inserted this message, and it says, yeah, your IMAP server wants to alert you to the following. Please download Microsoft's attacker.com/something something. And the nice thing is it even highlights links, and you can click on them. So, yeah. So as an attacker, you can send such a message to a client, and it actually looks like this is something from my mail server. Even though it was plain text, it was not protected in any way. Then there's an issue with buffering bugs. So this has been known for a while. The basic question here is which data is some data I get part of the TLS session or not? And there's sometimes some confusion about that. So there was a bug in postfix in 2011 already, where it turned out that you can send some commands in plain text where the server will actually think they were sent via TLS. And how does this happen? So this is how this is kind of just the part where the STARTTLS happens highlighted. So this is the normal version, like without an attack. So the client sends the STARTTLS command, gets this code as an answer, does a handshake, and sends some command. Now, what we can do with some servers is that we send this STARTTLS command and we send another command together with it in a single TCP package. And what some servers will do is then they will do a TLS handshake and then they will answer to that second command in the TLS session. And the server will kind of think that this is already part of the TLS session. So yeah, we can send something in plain text together with the STARTTLS command, and the server will consider this as part of the TLS connection. So this was originally found in postfix, as I said, but it turned out it affected basically most email servers out there. There were similar vulnerabilities in Cyrus, Courier, Qmail, and various proprietary email stacks. So there's an advisory from the US CERT, and it contains a very long list of vulnerable servers. Now, how can we attack this? So one issue with this was that the postfix developers described this bug in 2011, but they didn't really describe how to attack it. And there were, for example, some email threads where some mail server developer said, yeah, this is kind of strange behavior, but it's not really a vulnerability. They kind of denied that this is a bug because there was no exploit for it. But one way how you could imagine exploiting this is that you can send an email as an attacker to yourself, which will then contain the login data from a user. And this is a bit tricky to understand what's going on here. But what is happening here is basically the interesting part starts with the STARTTLS. And then we have an attacker that injects some commands with the STARTTLS. It injects a command, okay, this elo command, because that is just part of the protocol. It always comes after the TLS handshake. Then it sends an authentication command, and this is with login data from the attacker. So what we're assuming here is a mail service where the attacker has an account, something like a public free mail service. And then the attacker sends a mail from himself to himself. And then he basically, this data comment means now here comes the mail content. So, and then, okay, the server will answer this STARTTLS command, and then the client and the server will do a handshake. And then the server answers to all these commands that the attacker injected. And the client will read them line by line and process them. So the client will send his own elo command and will get the answer from the server, which is the answer to the command the attacker sent. And then the client will send his own authentication and the content of the email it wants to send. But everything that comes after here goes into the email that the attacker sent to himself. So basically the attacker gets an email, and that contains the most interesting part, the login data, which is basically just a base 64 encoding of the username and the password. So this is a pretty devastating attack. If you have a server vulnerable to this, it means you can steal login credentials from an email account. You can do a similar attack with IMAP, where the idea is that IMAP allows you to store a mail in a mailbox, and then you can do something very similar. It's a bit more tricky because you need to know the size of the stored message, but it works. The idea is basically the same. So we did a scan, and we found that 1.5% of SMTP servers that we could reach are vulnerable to this. Then 2.6% of POP3 servers and 2.4% of IMAP servers. So this is still a very widespread bug. Yeah? So the question was if we have a tool to test servers. Yes, but we haven't published it yet, but we will. Yeah. I have to say for POP3 we don't have an exploit because we didn't really have an idea how to attack this, because POP3 has no way to store or send an email. It's just to fetch mails from the server. But still we think it's a bug that should be fixed. Now, there's another question you could ask, and this is, can we do something similar the other way around? So can we send from the server side some additional commands that the client will interpret? And it turns out yes. So looking at this transition again, if the client sends the STARTTLS command and the server answers with this 220, okay, and then with something else, then the client will interpret this something else as part of the TLS connection. So yeah, the client can be vulnerable to the same class of bug. This is one of the major findings that we had during our research, and we called this a response injection. This can be used, for example, to spoof mailbox content. Like you can show the client an inbox with different content than what's actually in the inbox. It requires you to know which commands the client will send, but if you know what software the client is, then you kind of can know this. And here the thing was that more than half of the mail clients that we tested were vulnerable. So this is a very widespread bug, or was. I hope most of them are fixed by now, but this turned out to be very, very common. So kind of looking at this, this STARTTLS command injection was discovered in 2011 and affected multiple implementations. And we can see, even though it's 9 years old, we can still see quite a few vulnerable servers. So it's not been fixed everywhere. And also we saw that we can have the same type of bug on the client, and that affects the majority of implementations. So, and also, like, if you think about it, if you look at how you implement something like this, is you usually have a buffer where you read commands line by line, and it's basically very easy to implement this bug. Like, if you do a straightforward implementation and don't think about this, you will almost certainly have this bug in your code. And this is also why I would argue that this should not be seen as bugs in the client. I mean, of course, it is a bug in the implementation, but this is a systemic problem with the standard. This is a standard that makes it far too easy to get things wrong. There are some other issues with STARTTLS. In IMAP, there is something called pre-auth. So this is a feature where a server, directly after a client connects to it, can say, you are already logged in. You don't have to log in. So this is, for example, used if you have an internal network and you can do IP-based authentication, where you say, when this client connects, we know this IP, we know it cannot be spoofed, then it's already logged in. Now, STARTTLS, the standard clearly says that you must not do STARTTLS in an authenticated state. Now, if we take these two things together, then we kind of get a contradiction here. Because what if you have a client that wants to do STARTTLS, but the server answers with this pre-auth command? So it means kind of we're already logged in, we want to do STARTTLS, but we're not allowed to do STARTTLS. So we have a contradiction here. So we think that this is a logical inconsistency in the standard. And this is not really mentioned in the standard what to do there, but the only reasonable way to react to this is for a client to just say, stop, we're not connecting here. This doesn't make sense. But as you imagine, this is not what all the clients do. Like some clients, if you do a pre-auth connection, this is basically a way to prevent the STARTTLS transition from happening. So as an attacker, you can also send this pre-auth command, and that basically means you prevent the client from starting the encryption. So this obviously also leads to mailbox spoofing, because as an attacker we can just pretend to be the server, as there's no TLS, there's no authentication happening. But it may also lead to stealing mail content, because, for example, some clients will start to synchronize the mailbox if they connect with the server and the server has different mailbox content. So they may upload data from some folders. So yeah, this is also a pretty bad bug. Then there's another feature in Imap which is called Mailbox Referrals. And this is basically some kind of forwarding, where a server can say, hey, dear client, please log into this other mail server and get the mails from there. Now, if we combine these two things, like this pre-auth thing, where we, as a server, can tell the client, you're already logged in, so you cannot do encryption, and this mailbox referral, so we say to the client, yeah, please log into this other server. Then we again have an attack where we can steal credentials. We can tell the client, yeah, please log into my attacker server, and then the attacker server can record the credentials. Now, I have to say that this feature is not very widely supported, so most clients just don't support these referrals. There's a similar feature called login referrals, which where something similar can happen. And we only found one client where we could perform this attack, which was Alpine, which is a text mode-based email client. But still, I mean, I think the interesting thing is that there are features in Imap that don't play well with StarTLS, and it seems this is not very well thought of. Yeah, so to summarize what we had until now, yeah, StarTLS has a systemic problem with buffering bugs, both on the server and the client sides, and these are very, very common. We have several features in Imap that are problematic or outright insecure if we combine them with StarTLS. And also, StarTLS doesn't really have any security advantage. If we use normal implicit TLS, that is, it has all the security benefits without these downsides. So yeah, our conclusion is pretty clear here. We recommend just to not use StarTLS in mail client connections. So if you have a mail client that supports both, then you should configure it to not use StarTLS, but to use the implicit TLS port. If you have a server, of course, you should support the implicit TLS ports. And if you can, just disable the StarTLS support. And I say if you can, because I know if you have a mail server that has a lot of existing users and they may have different configurations, then it may not be easy to switch something off, which will break half of your user base. But for example, if you set up a new mail server, this could be a good idea to just not support StarTLS right from the beginning. Then we have this special case, which is the server-to-server connections, or MTA to MTA. MTA is just kind of a fancy acronym for mail server. It's for mail transfer agent. The situation there is a bit different. So for one, there's just currently no specified way to use implicit TLS connection for server-to-server situation. So we cannot just say don't use StarTLS because we don't have an encrypted alternative. And also, traditionally, the StarTLS in server-to-server connections was used in an opportunistic way. So there's usually no certificate validation, and we don't have an expectation here that it protects against an active attacker. It was usually used as something, yeah, we will encrypt if we can, but if not, then we will send the email unencrypted. However, this is slowly changing. So there are two mechanisms to try to secure these server-to-server connections in a better way. One of them is called DANE, it's based on DNSSEC, and the other is called MTA STS, which is kind of like a trust on first use kind of mechanism. I'm not going to discuss these in detail, that would be a separate talk. But just there is effort on the way to provide better security for these server-to-server connections. And then this starts to matter. Now, establishing an implicit TLS mode for these server-to-server connections, this would be challenging. Like, we would have to change standards that are very well established and that have not been changed a lot at all. So I don't see that happening anytime soon, that we will have a new way to do these server-to-server connections. So we'll probably have to live with StarTLS in this situation. But this is something to keep in mind. Like if we want to secure these connections with MTA STS or with DANE, then we need to make sure that we don't have these buffering bugs. Like these, because these buffering bugs could be used to undermine the efforts to secure these server-to-server connections. And yeah. Then StarTLS is also used in other protocols like XMPP, FTP, Managed Sieve, which is some kind of mail filtering thing. LDAP, MySQL has something which is not called StarTLS, but it's the same idea, or NNTP, and a lot of other protocols. We have not looked at these, but I think it's obvious that similar bugs to the ones we described can be found in other protocols. We can imagine similar attacks. So this is something that there's a lot of potential for further research here, like just looking at StarTLS in the context of other protocols. But still, our general recommendation, if you can choose between StarTLS and an implicit TLS connection, which, for example, you can in XMPP, then you should use the implicit TLS connection. But it's a very mixed situation. Like there are some protocols that have their own ports, some don't. Yeah, if you don't have implicit port, then of course you must use StarTLS. There's some bonus if you avoid StarTLS, and this is if you look at performance issues. If you have ever tried to send an email when you have a bad internet connection, like you're on a mobile connection, maybe in Germany, because mobile connections in Germany are notoriously bad. It's not like in Denmark. Then you would like to have that faster, because then your chances are just higher that it works. And I find this interesting because like a lot of effort has been put into reducing round trips in TLS, that you need fewer back and forth connections to establish a TLS connection. But it seems nobody has looked at how we could improve email protocols to have fewer round trips. And with StarTLS, this is quite obvious. All the information that we exchanged before the StarTLS transition, we basically should ignore because we cannot trust it. Like, for example, in SMTP, after we connect, we again send this elo command and get the server capabilities. So basically, everything that happens before the TLS handshake is wasted data. It's not very useful to us. So this kind of leads to the obvious conclusion that we don't use StarTLS, we have fewer round trips, and that's usually 2 to 4 round trips less. So it's basically a performance improvement for free. So yeah, if you avoid StarTLS, it's just faster. And there are some more ways to improve the round trips in email protocols. There's the authentication in email protocols uses something which is called SASL. Like this is a generic authentication framework, which which is used by all these 3 protocols and also by some others. And if you look at this, this can look very differently. Like this upper thing here, we have, this is now in Imap, but we have authenticate plain, and then we have something which is basically just a base 64 encoding of the username and password with some 0 bytes, but it's just specified in the standard. Or we can have this other variation, which is where we say authenticate login, then we get a username prompt, which is base 64 encoded. I'm not sure what the point of this is, but that's how this is specified. And then we send a username base 64 encoded, and then we get a password prompt base 64 encoded and send the password. So this is 3 round trips versus 1. So there's quite a bit of potential to optimize here. So one thing here is that Imap has a feature which is called SASL IR, which basically means you can send this authenticate command and already send the authentication data in one line. So this is what you have here. Like you have this authenticate, then the mechanism, and then already the login data in one line. And also SASL has for basic authentication, that means like username password authentication, which is what almost everyone is using. It has two authentication modes, plain and login. To make it a bit more complicated, even the POP3 and Imap, they both have their own built-in authentication method, which is not part of STARTTLS. In Imap, this works with 1 round trip. In POP3, it takes 2 round trips. This STARTTLS login mechanism, which is the one with the username, password in separate lines, this is not standardized, and it's declared as obsolete in the registry for STARTTLS by the IANA. And we have this plain method, which is it's standardized in RFC, and it says it sends username and password in one line, in one base64 encoding. So plain is standardized and it's faster than login. So this is two advantages. There's not really a point in using this login mechanism. If you look around, like almost everyone supports both servers and clients. They usually support plain and login, and there's not really an order to use them. So I figured out, okay, my client seems to prefer this slower, non-standardized version. So if I disable it on the server, it can no longer do that, and then it becomes faster. So if you want to have a bit faster email connections, then yeah, use implicit TLS and not StarTLS. Support this STARTTLS IR mechanism in Imap, and disable the STARTTLS login method and only support the plain method, because that's fewer round trips. Yeah, that was my talk. Yeah, I'm open for questions. Yeah.
Timing done. I
Uh,
mean, I'm the attacker. I don't know when my friend is getting his emails, but I want to steal his data.
okay.
All the time and wait.
No. I mean, it's a man-in-the-middle attack, right? So you're waiting for the client to. You're doing maybe like, for example, here you could do ARP spoofing for the server that he connects to, and then when he starts a connection, then you're injecting this stuff. Yeah.
It feels a bit similar to the TLS 1.3 attacks when you're sending stuff before you really have.
So you're referring to the zero RTT thing,
Yes.
right? I don't really see the similarity, but so his question was if there's similar, that he says it feels similar to the TLS 1.30 RTT things. Yeah. I mean, the zero RTT, the problem there is that you can do replay attacks, right? Where you send the same data again that has been sent before.